Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Uh, Welcome to our webinar today on moving from VMware to Azure with proven migration paths that minimize disruption. During this webinar today, we are going to talk about a handful of different things. Number one, why are we here? Obviously, this is a very important topic, and we want to make sure that people understand what the downsides of staying on VMware are, why we're seeing a big uptick in some of our customers moving off of it. We're going to talk about what Azure VMware solution is as a potential target. Chace is then going to talk a little bit about moving into Azure native solutions. We're going to talk about some of our offerings, how we can help you move, and then next steps in getting a hold of us. For those of you who haven't been on a webinar with me yet, my name is Tom Lilly. I'm our field CTO for cloud solutions here at Metrics. I sit in our office of the CTO working with our customers to develop strategic solutions and align business desires with actual technical implementations. And with me, I am joined by Mr. Chace Akers, who I will let introduce himself. Chace.
I'm Chace Akers, principal cloud architect here with Metrics, working with Tom for many years on this process. So I'm a little more boots on the ground, doing some of the implementations, right, hands-on for some of these technologies. So with that as an intro, let's talk about some of the drivers behind why the customers, there's this mass exodus from VMware. So really, ultimately, a lot of this is tied to the rising cost in our licensing. The minimum requirements have gone up, really alienating a lot of the small to mid sized businesses. Those groups are now looking for alternatives to VMware, whether that be Azure Native or AVS or something on premises. If you want to get to the next slide there, Tom. Right. So the rising cost in expenses, we've touched on this. VMware, I think there's 72 procs or maybe 96. 72 was the last time I looked. They were talking about 96 processors for your system. That's a pretty big expense for anyone. That creates a huge financial burden for these clients if they're not really dug into VMware. Moving them into some other hypervisor is very likely going to be an alternative for these guys. Again, whether that be Hyper-V or Azure Local or AVS or some other component.
And I mean,
good time.
From what I'm seeing, and not to cut you off, Chace, but one of the major things that I'm hearing from my customers is the fact that these costs are not just small increases. We have heard from several of our clients that we're not just talking about even 100 to 200% increase in cost, but we have some clients that are reporting to us a 14 to 1600% increase in the cost of their VMware licensing, and that's driven a lot by the increase in minimums. It's just the cost of licensing going up in general. And it's really putting a lot of pressures on our customers to figure out an alternate. And that's where we come in, and why we have this webinar that we're putting on, and why we're talking to our customers. I mean, Chace, I know as you mentioned before, we've been having these discussions, for quite some time, but I think just in the past, call it 2 months, how many calls have we been on together where we've been talking about customers that are looking to move off of VMware? I think we've done at least 1 to 2 dozen of them. At least it feels like we have.
It's been a few.
Yeah. So this is very top of mind for a lot of our customers, and we're seeing a lot of it in the market as well. And it's really just comes down to people don't want to pay. And not to talk bad about Broadcom, but I think it's one of the things that they're really trying to do is maximize their revenues and maximize their profits. And unfortunately, it means that they are squeezing out a lot of their customers. And Chace, I'll turn it back to you.
No, it's perfect. We just touched on that, right? Their revenue stream potentially squeezes out that small to mid-sized business. They're targeting their enterprise clients, right? And it's really putting a lot of strain. The small to mid-sized business features, those licenses, the essentials licenses, that stuff used to be a pretty cost-effective way for someone to get involved in VMware. you could get something for $500, you could get something in the arena of 5,000, and now the order of magnitude is 100,000 in some instances just to replace what you've got on prem. So it's a pretty high increase. And again, one of the reasons why certainly small to mid-size clients are getting away from VMware, but I think in general, even some of the enterprise solutions, right, we're going to get into Azure and leverage some of those native, advanced native services that we've got out there. So um, we've talked through this a little bit. This slide talks about those deprecations of those features, and it really comes down to the licensing. They're getting rid of those essential licenses so that you can't have a reasonably built and reasonably affordable footprint with VMware. So reduces the appeal, right, to the clients. It's just if you're taking those licenses away, you're going to charge someone a magnitude or 100 times what's out there now, right? So these are really the reasons why folks are looking at other solutions like AVS or Azure Native, and we'll talk through some of those as we get into this.
Yeah, and I mean that's a perfect segue to start talking a little bit about AVS or Azure VMware Solution. Where we're seeing a lot of our customers really lean into AVS as a platform really comes down to if you have entire teams that are dedicated to running VMware and you have, operations, you've got engineering, you've got other, people that are responsible for your infrastructure. If they have a lot of VMware expertise, we're seeing a lot of our customers then take advantage of AVS as that target solution. It is deployed on Azure. It's actually deployed on bare metal in Azure. It's a fully certified solution by Broadcom and by VMware. And the other really nice thing, then we'll talk about this here in a little bit, is you can get reservations for these hosts. So now you can actually lock in your pricing. You know exactly what your pricing is going to be for these hosts for the next, 1, 3, or in some cases even 5 years. So for our customers that really have that heavy investment in VMware, whether it's in just in personnel or in monitoring and management tools, it really becomes that solution. For those of you who have not seen Azure VMware Solution or AVS, this is really what it looks like. On the left side of the slide, you can see you've got your traditional on-premises data center where you've got your hosts, you've got vSphere as your traditional management plane. You've got all the networking capabilities that are provided by NSX, obviously distributed virtual switching and things like that. You've got your traditional storage, whether that is fiber channel, it could be iSCSI, it could be NFS, it could be vSAN. A lot of our customers are obviously are running vSAN and kind of eschewing and getting rid of your more traditional remote storage. Whatever that looks like on premises today, we can then pair that into Azure VMware Solution in Azure itself. And what that also looks like is essentially bare metal hosts in an Azure data center. Those do run vSAN, although at the time of this webinar, it is in preview to use other solutions like Azure Elastic SAN. And then you essentially have your connectivity through traditional cross-premises Azure capabilities. So this is things like deploying a VPN. It's implementing Azure Express Route. You could even extend your SD-WAN fabric. There are a lot of really good capabilities that allow you to essentially extend your cluster or deploy a sister cluster into Azure. The one thing to keep in mind for those of you who haven't been keeping up with your ESX, that it does require at least vSphere 7.0. If you have an older version, you will have to do an upgrade. I think the latest is 8.3, or actually even higher than that at this time. So hopefully you're not running anything super old, but it does have a minimum requirement of vSphere 7.0. We're going to talk a little bit about migration, so I'm not really going to dive into that here. But the other really important piece to keep in mind here is that with your Azure VMware solution, you also get a solution called HCX. And the reason we like to talk about HCX is one of the big problems that we see from a lot of our customers, and that's network extension. So in a traditional migration, which Chace will talk about here in just a little bit, as you move into Azure, your virtual machines that live on-prem, they get migrated into what's called a virtual network in Azure. That virtual network in Azure is a routable layer 3 network. The issue that we generally run into, though, is that because it's routable, you can't have an overlapping IP space. Generally speaking, services don't like having overlapping IPs without some sort of NAT device and a whole bunch of other trickery in the middle to make it look like it's actually on a completely different network. Some applications, depending on what you're using today, will take that IP change without issues. Some applications will take exception to it and will not want to have their IPs changed. So because of that, one of the big things, at least that I see, is going through and having to update connection strings, having to update DNS, having to make a change to IP addresses. Sometimes you forget you've got a static entry somewhere, and now you've caused a small outage, even more than you were expecting as you go through this migration. What we have with HCX is the ability to actually do stretch networking. So what that looks like is you deploy an HCX connector on premises, you deploy an HCX connector in your AVS cluster as well, and that essentially allows you to designate networks that can span between the two separate clusters. So now, as we're going into a full migration, as we're moving workloads from on-premises into the cloud, as we are, making things deploy in Azure, there's no native IP change that's needed. The other nice thing is that there are also some built-in capabilities to do things like reduce hairpinning, to have more streamlined network access, network topologies, and things like that. As we're talking to our customers about Azure VMware solution, this is one of the major selling points that we see, and we talk to our customers about, is really that ability to do that stretch networking. And at the same time, it's also being able to leverage your normal tooling. Azure VMware solution, even though it is an Azure solution and can be, viewed and maintained and managed from the Azure portal, is still a vSphere centric solution. So if you're used to working with vSphere, which you probably are if you're, using VMware on premises, you can continue to use vSphere in the cloud to manage those VMs. There's a lot of that, once again, just familiarity that you can get as you run and as you manage those solutions and as you manage your cloud. So as we're talking about it, we do as I mentioned before, a lot of the reasons that we see AVS is for those, major tools, and being able to allow your users and your administrators to keep using it as expected. Azure VMware solution does have a minimum. So because it runs vSAN in Azure, there is a 3-node minimum for Azure VMware solution to operate effectively. That obviously ensures that you have full replication of data, you've got full availability. That can drive the cost up for some customers. If you have a large enough environment or you have a large enough virtual machine density to take proper advantage of it, then it's probably not going to matter. But it is something that we do want to make sure people are aware of, because it is something, as you move into Azure, as you deploy your landing zone, as you get cost management, optimization, billing, et cetera, it will certainly increase your monthly cost for running your Azure environment. The other really great thing about HCX, so I've talked a lot about the network integrations, I've talked a lot about doing the site pairings, but HCX also becomes the major solution that we use for migration as well. So what we have here are just some information about how you can do migration using HCX. So the first one is OS assisted vMotion. So if you take a look at, traditional vMotion between clusters, this is relatively analogous to it, where you can select, a handful of virtual machines, you can kind of move them over piecemeal as needed. That's a really great way to sort of minimize downtime. It's all done live for you. You don't really have to worry about, taking that outage or things like that. If you have a larger number of virtual machines that you want to move, we also have what's called replication assisted vMotion. So that replication assisted vMotion is going to essentially precede that data. It's going to be used more for bulk migration. So hey, we've got a bunch of VMs that we want to move all at once. Maybe we've got a large maintenance window. Maybe we just have to get out of our data center, or we just want this thing to go quickly. We can use that replication assisted vMotion to essentially move machines in bulk, and not sort of the onesie twosie sort of piece. The other important thing to keep in mind is making sure you're grouping your VMs. So if you have 15, 20 virtual machines that make up an individual application, maybe you've got a business criticality or a tier of virtual machines. Maybe you've got different SDLC environments, whether that's production, development, test. You can set up these mobility groups to essentially logically group them together so that as they move that they're going to move together, that they're going to be able to be migrated appropriately, that you're not going to be leaving virtual machines behind, et cetera. And then as you get into the migration, as you complete the migration, as I mentioned before, you've got that your mobility optimized networking or MON. So that allows you to do automated route management and then do better flow conditioning and app path resiliency as you do that migration. So what that means is that the networking is going to be optimized for your virtual machines to be able to talk to each other, whether that is cross premises, whether that is in the same cluster in Azure. For a lot of our customers, as they undertake these migrations, the biggest thing that they have to keep in mind is that they're going to be running hybrid for a bit. You can't just take 1,000 machines and say, cool, we're going to move those over right now into Azure. You're going to be running in a state where you've got some stuff on premises, you've got some stuff in the cloud. Maybe you have other virtual machines that are running in a traditional virtual network as Azure native. So by having some of these, the traffic engineering capabilities, by having MON in the environment, we can make sure that all those routes and everything is operating appropriately. You're not excessively adding in additional hops between two servers that are going to live right next to each other on the same physical hosts in Azure. So all those capabilities are enabled by HCX Enterprise. The other really nice thing about AVS as a solution is that it comes with native licensing for HCX Enterprise. So even if you don't have it today in your data center on premises, by purchasing and implementing Azure VMware solution, you are fully entitled to the enterprise version of HCX to deploy that connector, to do the integration, and to take advantage of all of these features. Which I think is a great value add for anybody who wants to take this migration into VMware really seriously. And it's all deployed and managed from the Azure portal. It itself is a fantastic solution. As you can see here, a lot of other capabilities that we don't even have time to get into today. But highly recommend, if you are going to be doing an AVS deployment, that HCX be the primary driver for making that happen. So that gets into how do we minimize our risks in outage. So number one, plan. I can't tell you how many times I go and talk to our customers and there's like, yeah, we're just going to move stuff. Cool. How? When? Where? What's the target? What's the order? When you fail it over, what has to come up first? Where do you have hard-coded connection strings or static IP addresses, as we've been talking about? IP helpers are everybody's friend that have to be updated. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into that planning. That's not just, I need to replicate this VM and move it over into the target. By going VMware to VMware, it is a little bit easier than your traditional planning that Chace will talk about here in just a second. But you still want to make sure you know what's moving and when it's moving. You want to build out your waves. You want to do testing. You want to bring lower environments over first. You want to even rebuild some tools to like Active Directory domain controllers to take advantage of newer capabilities, or to minimize the risk to your user databases and things like that. I cannot stress enough, and anybody who's talked to me probably knows this, how much planning goes into a full migration, especially a migration of any size. It is exceedingly important. I will also say that doing testing is also very important. Once again, by using tools like HCX and going into AVS, the outage potential is drastically reduced, but it's still not zero. So make sure that you're testing features, make sure that you're testing the migration of VMs. Once again, if you have lower SDLC environments that you can move an entire application over, make sure that you don't have increased latency, make sure you don't have increased transaction latency, make sure that you have full user access into the network segments, make sure that the machines can talk to each other, that that MON is actually working appropriately. Make sure you go through all those tests. Make sure you have a full test plan. Have test users, have administrators that know what they're doing, and actually work through it to make sure they know how to operate and what everything should look like after it's been migrated. So that number one item on this slide here for planning and testing, I will wax poetic about it for a lot longer, but I do want to move on and let Chace get a chance to speak as well. But we have talked about HCX, you know, because it's included with AVS. It's absolutely worth deploying. You should be migrating using HCX. You should be implementing it. You should be doing, all the integration that you can to make that migration as seamless as possible. Whether you choose to extend your networks or not, whether you choose to use, bulk migration versus vMotion, it's really up to you and which of those features you want to use. But absolutely take advantage of it. You've got the licensing, you've got the tooling for it, so you might as well at the end of the day. The other thing about rollback and network extension is don't keep it in place for too long. So if you need to, or once you complete your migration, things like removing Mon from the environment, making sure that you're just using the native distributed virtual switching in Azure and Azure VMware solution, that reduces complexity. It reduces the potential of having, extra hops get injected into your routes. Really just reduces the chance of things potentially going wrong. So, don't try to run in that mechanism for too long. Obviously, as you're running hybrid, as you're running the environment, and as you're undertaking migration, you're going to have to do it. That's just a foregone conclusion. But do make sure that you roll back those solutions once you are finished with your migration. During the migration, the other important thing is to also have a rollback plan for your individual applications. So what happens if an app doesn't come up cleanly? What happens if my database is corrupted? What happens if my application server doesn't boot? What happens if I don't have the right firewall rules to present my web server out to the public? Make sure that as you're going through your planning, you're accounting for all of those things, but also accounting for rollback. What is my outage window? Is it 1 hour? Is it 4 hours? Is it an entire day for lower environments? Have that defined and stick to it. I'd say one of the biggest things that I see from my customers in any sort of migration is that they don't stick to their test plans, they don't stick to their rollback plans, and they just say, okay, it's just one more thing. Okay, it's just one more thing. It's just one more thing. And what happens is that one thing becomes 5 things, becomes 10 things, becomes 20 things. And now your 1 hour outage window is up to hour 5. And what's going to happen in that instance is that your executives that are tracking this, or hopefully tracking this, are going to lose faith and confidence. They don't think you're going to be able to get the job done, whether you're leveraging a partner like Netrix or whether you're trying to do it internally. So what's going to happen then is that you're going to ask for another outage window, and maybe that doesn't go right. Then you're going to ask for another outage window, and maybe that doesn't go right. And by the end of it, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of finger pointing, and at the end of the day, it could all be sort of worked around if you just have a rollback plan. It's a lot better to roll back and come at it again another day rather than trying to shoehorn in a migration that is just going to go poorly. Whether that's for performance reasons, whether that's for outage reasons or whatever. So don't be afraid of rolling back. Once again, not to keep talking about HCX, but it is kind of the star of the show today. It does get a lot easier if you are running solutions like HCX to be able to do that migration back into your on-premises data center. And then finally, take advantage of some of the native tooling, or as much native tooling as you can from an Azure perspective. As we talk about things like Azure Monitor, as we talk about things like cost management and billing, Azure Policy, Azure Arc even, make sure that you know what each of those are. Make sure you have a good idea of, what the tooling is, maybe how it compares to something like VROps, or into, other maybe potential monitoring and tooling that you have today. If you have tools out there already as well that you're using, so things like a Splunk, or maybe like a Datadog or other APM tools, don't think you have to move into Azure native solutions as you move into AVS. The nice thing about AVS is it's extensible enough to continue to work with a lot of your existing tooling. But especially if you're planning on any sort of modernization and moving into Azure native services out of AVS, then getting more familiar with the native tooling can certainly make that a little bit easier as well, for the longer term. And by that, we're talking 3 to 5 year goals, if not even longer than that. So with that, that's been Azure VMware solution. Hopefully you learned something as a part of this, but one of the things that we also want to talk about is, how do we get out of VMware into Azure native? For a lot of our smaller customers, even some of our mid-sized customers, Azure VMware solution is just going to be too cost prohibitive, or it's just for some organizations, it's kicking the can down the road. It's still maintaining that relationship with VMware, even though it's on Microsoft papers and purchased through the Azure portal. So one of the other things that we certainly want to talk about is, what if you don't want to go into Azure VMware solution? What if you want to go into Azure native? And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chace to talk a little bit about getting into native solutions. So Chace, back over to you.
Right. Thanks, Tom. Great discussion here. So Tom talked about migration planning, right? Regardless of whether we're moving into an on-prem solution or a cloud solution, transitioning between hypervisors, which is really kind of the heart of what we're talking about today. There's got to be planning, right? And HCX, to me, we're talking about kind of the premium version of what we're trying to do. We're trying to maintain your tooling knowledge. We're trying to extend your layer 2 up to the cloud. That makes site recovery and failover significantly easier. It doesn't eliminate planning, but it helps things like those static IP addresses that are hard-coded in somebody's code that we just don't know about. If you're not going to leverage ABS, right, and you're going to go into something native, Azure native, the planning is probably an additional set of tasks that you've got to consider, because we're not using a HCX over top of this. We're not extending layer 2. We're going to have to go in and make modifications to IP addresses. When we land these servers in Azure, you're going to have to change DNS. There's going to have to be some static updates. There may be potential code updates. So we can't talk or express with enough emphasis how important planning is and how important rollback is. The rollback gives you the opportunity, if you've gone forward and you find that something didn't work like we expected, we can roll back, kind of reset expectations and replan. But planning is essential in any of these things. The Azure Migrate is going to help us do a little bit of that planning. I'll talk about that just in a few minutes. But understanding we're going from an on-prem workload, in this instance coming out of VMware, you could be coming out of some other hypervisor and going into the Azure infrastructure. So a good understanding of how we can optimize that, how we can leverage those things, those services effectively, right? The benefits of being in Azure, getting out of having an on-prem data center, for example. Again, those small to mid-sized businesses, right? That maybe your data center's in a closet, right? And it's not very well air conditioned, or the power is not mature in that segment. Getting into a cloud solution handles all of those things for you. Tom, it looked like you had something you were.
Yeah, the one thing, or one of the things that you mentioned is that second point there, which is an understanding of Azure infrastructure. A lot of people want to treat Azure like it's just another data center. And to an extent, that's true. I don't want to downplay the fact that is the case. Like, there's still networking, there's still storage, there's still compute, there's still, all the traditional data center capabilities. But they do operate a little bit differently. Having to t-shirt size your virtual machines is different for a lot of our customers. Like, you can't just go out there and through Azure native deploy a 7 CPU and 39.5 gigabyte RAM virtual machine. Like, it's just not a thing, right? So having an understanding of how the infrastructure works and where it differs from traditional management is going to be important. The other big one, and I'm trying not to make this a webinar about networking, but the other big one is also networking. Having an understanding how virtual networks work and how they peer and how they operate and how they route and how you affect those routes and how you insert firewalls. I think one of the biggest things that I've seen for customers is, hey, we've got this firewall on premises and it's got a leg in every single VLAN. You're like, no, that's not how it works in Azure. You can't have a firewall that's a member of 15 different virtual networks. Like it's just not a thing. This is how it all works, and this is how you change your monitoring and you change your implementation and things like that. So I think having that understanding and going through the training of what Azure is and how it works is definitely important. And not, once again, not to take away from any of the other items here, but it's probably one of the biggest differences you have between AVS and Azure Native. Once again, AVS is great because vSphere, how vSAN works, how distributed virtual switching works. It's all the same at the end of the day. Where Azure it's a transition. And we've been lucky here at Netrix that we've ridden that transition and done really well, and have some amazing Azure experts that can talk about both, such as Chace. So I think we're lucky to be able to do that, and some organizations are not quite that lucky. So,
those are great points.
That's what I wanted.
The idea of t-shirt sizing, I'm going to use that in future state, because we run into that, right? What Tom's talking about is you've got a 4 CPU, 12 gig of RAM system on-prem that doesn't fit one of your t-shirts, right? So you've got to decide, do you want to undersize or oversize something? Partnering with someone like Netrix, we can help guide you guys through that. We can do some sizing operations. And point of fact, part of Azure Migrate is going to help us do some of those things. Thanks, Tom.
That was a great.
That is perfect. Thank you. So the Azure Migrate appliance, it's going to have one is going to get deployed in your data center, right, side by side. So you can either spin up a virtual machine and on that virtual machine put the appliance software, or we can just spin it right out of an OVA template and spin that up in the environment. It's going to hook into your vCenter in your vSphere ESXi hosts. If it were Hyper-V, it would do the same hook, right? It's got hooks into the hypervisors themselves. And we can start to look at what your environment looks like currently. And then as part of that assessment, Microsoft is going to make recommendations, and it's going to give you some idea about what it's going to look like when it lands. It's going to give you some idea about rough cost and estimating some of those things, so we can start to talk about, this is what your monthly reoccurring is. So when you're transitioning into native, you're really kind of going from a CapEx, we're going to put a hardware solution on-prem, to an OpEx, we're going to pay monthly for these things as they land here. Tom, when I see you go off mute, I'm like, add to the conversation.
No, you're doing great. Keep going. I'll jump in when you're done.
So we're going to hook directly into your VMware, right? We're going to take a look at some of those things. We're going to do those resource estimations. We're going to start putting a migration plan together for you. It's going to give you some kind of templated data. You still have to really think through, what does it look like when my application goes from this on-premises server and its current IP, right? You got to realize, again, and not to make it a network discussion, but that HCX overlay and extending your layer 2, it really removes a lot of the complexity when you're moving something from one data center to another. When we get it into Azure, we've got to make sure that we have the hooks in the right place. We've got the firewall in the right place so that we can get web servers pushed out to the public. You're going to have to renumber. You're definitely going to have a different subnet. All of that comes into play. If this is your first venture into Azure, there needs to be a landing zone, and it needs to be built well and correctly. Again, a partner like Netrix helps you build some of that out, and we have a proper place to land. But all of that planning, I don't think we could emphasize enough. You've got to understand what it's going to look like once it lands in the cloud. We tend to work with application level folks. You're going to have some in-house thing that was built that guy knows, and we're going to have to work with them and understand, is there code updates that have to get pushed to go change these IPs? And some of these are their static IPs that have to be updated. So planning is absolutely critical in all of this, and we'll touch on this in a moment. Rollback as well. In our instance, I think this tees us up right into the backup slide, does it not?
It does, but before we get into the
Sure,
actual
sure.
into that piece, one of the other things that I wanted to mention about Azure Migrate. So as Chase mentioned, it plugs straight into your hypervisor. You can also do physical servers for what it's worth if you have a largely physical environment, especially for like things like larger SQL servers or where you don't want to have resource contention. But the other thing is if you have looked at Azure Migrate in the past and you haven't looked at it recently. Take a look at it again. Microsoft has made some significant investments in Azure Migrate as a planning and wave planning solution. I know we don't want this to be a networking webinar, but we also don't want this to be an AI webinar either. But Microsoft has sort of added AI into Azure Migrate to actually help, do some initial wave planning and things like that. So once again, the thing to take away from this, same thing on the HCX side, use the tools you have at your fingertips. Use the tools that you have available to you, because they're going to natively integrate. They're going to make your life easier. And once again, see if I can get this transition right, but it's not just going to be cloud native tools. It's also the things you already have deployed on premises as well. And that could be something like your backup tooling, which Chase, I'll turn it back over to you to talk through.
Right. Thanks, Tom. So with that head, I spun out for a second there thinking about some of the additional planning that goes on in there. But backup solutions, right? We're expecting that you have a backup solution in place. I would like to think that most, even small businesses, have got some backup. We could potentially leverage backup in a site recovery scenario, right? And we could use that to migrate our off-prem workloads into Azure. I think for this webinar, really what we're talking about is adding this in as a supplemental tool for us to be able to do some risk mitigation, right? Be able to roll back. So in the AVS solution and the CX components over top of that, the rollback is a little easier than some of the migrations that we'll face here, because we're going to have to re-IP and think through some of those things. But backup tools, Commvault or Veeam or Azure Backup, whatever it is that you happen to be using, we're going to leverage that as supplemental help to this. We're always going to protect the data. And the Azure Migrate process itself, there's going to be an initial seeding of data and then a delta of that data so that we stay current. And then at some point, it's going to take its final delta and it's going to shut the machine off, and we're going to be live in Azure. There's some renumbering that's going to happen there, but there is always potential for something there to not go cleanly, not go smoothly. In a perfect world, if we had to roll back, we would back out our DNS changes, we would turn down the Azure server, we would go back to our on-prem server and just light it back up, right? But, hedge your bets, right? Leverage your existing equipment, make a backup, a point-in-time backup of that device prior to migration. I'm a big proponent of catching it post-migration too when it lands, so that we can leverage that for testing if we need to, and just be aware of some of those things, supplementing some of the migration components that we're going through here. And again, we talk about risk mitigation and rollback a lot. You're not going to know what you don't know, right? We can plan as much as we can plan. We move some home-baked application that the guy retired and he wrote it in COBOL, right? We just don't have access to this guy. So we're going to have to contend with getting back on-prem and undoing those changes. Ideally, if we can keep that Azure system up, we can potentially renumber or isolate that thing and start to do some work around correcting whatever it is we corrected. But in the interim, you've got to get back to your on-prem facility and continue your day-to-day operations while we figure out those components. So backup we could use as a replication technology, some site recovery, but for the most part, for this webinar, in my mind, this is really, let's leverage this as a supplemental way to get us back, right, to a point where we're functional, right, while we figure out what problem we created by moving.
Yeah, and hopefully nothing super crazy, but it is really important to maintain your continuity, your BCPs as you're running through, this procedure, because the worst thing that can happen, and unfortunately it does happen on occasion, is you're in the middle of a migration and you're hit with an outage. Whether that is predicated by the migration or whether it's just bad timing, and somebody forgot to knock on wood before they kicked it off. It can happen, and it does happen, and we hate to see it. So don't skimp on BCPs, don't skimp on making sure you still keep all this stuff in place as you're undertaking that migration. One of the other things that I also highly recommend to my customers is validating that after you move stuff, that it's still being protected. And Chace touched on this as well, is a lot of times our customers will move a VM into the cloud and be like, cool, it's in the cloud, I don't have to worry about it anymore. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Using tools like Azure Policy to enforce, enabling Azure Backup, extending Veeam into the cloud as a cloud backup solution. Make sure you're going through all of those things for the long-term operationalization of the environment. And that goes, by the way, for whether you're using AVS or Azure native. The tools integrate really nicely with either solution. So making sure that you've got that in place and you've got that as part of your post cutover checklist. Once again, going back to the planning piece, is very important. So once again, not to jump in and Chase, but I don't know.
No, this has been good. But I think, and Tom nailed it right. This is definitely part of your planning, and I hate to say that I see it more than I like. Folks don't consider that they have to enable backups for the devices that they just moved. So leverage the tools at hand, right? To Tom's point, you've got the ability to set policies to remind you, because we're human, right? We're fallible. I'd like to say we're perfect, but that's just not the case. So leverage what you have available to you.
Yeah, definitely. And keep in mind that backup and DR are two different things too. It's something I talked to a lot of my customers about. It was like, oh yeah, well, we're replicating this into another region already. What do I need backup for? And it's like, well, ransomware can get replicated too. Like you probably want to have something in place. Or hey, we're backing up. Why do we need to put this into another region? Well, what happens if this region goes down? A handful of other things like that. So once again, not here to talk that much about backup and DR, but two very important things to always keep in mind as you get into the migration and after the migration.
Go ahead, Tom. I think that leads us to talking about how Netrix can help you guys get to these get through these planning and migration states. So Tom, I think that one's probably a you slide, but
probably. Yeah, and for those on this webinar who have talked to me, you're probably familiar with these, but for those that haven't, we can help all the way from assessing your environment all the way through running it through our managed services team. The place where I generally like to start with my customers is a cloud readiness assessment. Are you even poised to move to the cloud? Is it right for you as an organization? Does it make sense? What are some of the things to keep in mind? Do you need assistance in moving this up the chain to your CTO, your CIO, your CFO, who's got to now switch to OpEx? Let's talk about whether you're even ready for the cloud. Not everybody is, and the worst thing that we can try to do is shoehorn organization into migrating to the cloud when they're just not ready to do so. It's also at this time, by the way, that we generally start to talk about other options for on-premises. I know that this webinar has been very focused on migrating from VMware into Azure, and that is certainly an option and one where we're seeing a lot of our customers move. Microsoft has also made a lot of significant investments in a solution called Azure Local, used to be called Azure Stack HCI, which is essentially the ability to bring Azure into your data center. It gives you a lot of the same capabilities as you have in the cloud, gives you the same management plane, allows you to implement Azure Arc. So that is also an option. So if you're not ready for the cloud, but you want to, maybe still get off of VMware, maybe you want to start dipping your toe into what having a cloud solution could work, then using Azure Local as a private cloud is certainly an option there, and something we can absolutely give you some recommendations on if it's determined that you're not ready to go fully into Azure. Or maybe it's a partial solution. Maybe you are going to be running a hybrid cloud for years and years to come. And part of that solution could be Azure Local, in addition to Azure Commercial, or even Azure Gov, depending on your segment here. But helping with that cloud readiness, and then doing that Azure Migrate assessment, getting the Migrate appliance deployed, getting it hooked into your VMware environment, getting it hooked into the physical servers, building out some of the wave planning, giving you information on potential costing, sizing, some of those recommendations that we can make based on our years of experience in doing this, to sort of make sure that we know how things should be sequenced. We can absolutely help with that migration assessment, and see what it's going to look like as you get migrated. To kind of prep you for that migration itself, building out a landing zone. Chace made a great reference to landing zones earlier, which is usually what I do. So thank you, Chace, for bringing that up. But having policy, role-based access control, naming conventions, IP schemes, edge networking protections, data plane protections, management plane protections, putting all those in place is extremely important to running a long-term Azure environment. And that actually also spans between AVS and Azure native. Just because you're going into VMware doesn't mean you don't have a landing zone. Landing zones are as important with AVS as they are with Azure native solutions. And we can help build out everything from a very simple handful of management group landing zone all the way out to a full enterprise scale, and even subsidiary landing zones like AI landing zones and application landing zones and things like that. So it can absolutely help you sort of lay that foundation for moving into Azure all the way up into the migration itself. Hey, let's take these virtual machines from on-premises and move them into Azure. Let's talk about app modernization and moving from a traditional Linux server into a web app. Let's containerize these workloads. Let's take advantage of auto scaling capabilities. And Azure migration isn't just taking a VM out of VMware and putting it in the cloud. It's everything from that up to let's really take advantage of cloud native solutions. And then the one that I forgot to put on the slide is managing the environment. As Chace mentioned, and we talked about earlier, the training component and getting up to speed on how Azure works and how the tooling operates, and a change in dashboards and where things are located does take time. We have dedicated managed services teams all around the world that can put 24/7 eyes on your environment and give you either be full support or be first call if something were to go wrong, and then escalating out to your teams as needed. So we have those teams that follow the sun and can provide that 24/7, 365 support as well, for long-term management and monitoring. Chace, anything else? I know we can help in a lot of different ways. Is there anything else I'm missing before we wrap up?
Well, I like, going through the landing zone if they don't have that, or at least assessing what their current footprint is, right? We can help them with that. So we've got really two sides of the house. There's pro services side where we're going to go in and do the effort of that, and then handing that off to our managed services team, right? So we can kind of take you full service, right? We'll come in and do the initial components of this all the way up through handing it off to the monitoring team. We've also got the office of CTO that Tom works in, right? We can help educate you. You may not know what is available to you, right? In Azure, you're just getting into Azure because you've got to get off of your on-prem data because VMware is a bully and they're making you pay a bunch of money. It's an opportunity for us to educate and run workshops and say, here are some of the features that you're going to get when you get to the cloud. So a lot of depth and breadth in our teams.
Absolutely. And once again, unsure if it was planned as a transition or not, but that does segue nicely into contacting us. If you want to get a hold of us, if you're an existing customer, please reach out to your account executive. If you're not an existing customer and you want to chat about any of the things we've talked about today or any other topics that we can cover, please reach out to us at info@nexusglobal.com. It's a great way to get a hold of us, and we'll certainly respond and have some conversations about not only Azure, but anything else that you may be thinking about. But with that, I want to thank everybody who joined us for this webinar, and thank you, Chace, for co-presenting with me. You did a great job, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.